Okay, so now we're recording. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Elham Shikari and I'm a research assistant at Florida State University. And as you can hopefully see on the shared slide screen, the title for this webinar is Adaptation Urbanism and Resilient Communities, Transforming Streets to Address Climate Change. And you can see here the committee scope for the AMS 50 Economic Development and Land Use Committee. The committee focuses on impacts of transportation on the economy, environment, and society. It is concerned with efficient, effective, and equitable transportation systems that promotes competitive advantage, economic resiliency, and sustainability for our cities, regions, and societies. This committee provides a cross-cutting forum for practitioners and researchers to understand the interrelationship between transportation, economic development, and the economy and land use, and the policies and management approaches required to create sustainable growth at national, regional, and local scales. And to the right of the screen, you could see how you can become a friend of this committee. All you have to do is log into My TRB, go to committees, click on Become a Friend of a Committee, find AMS 50 and become a friend. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can go ahead, type it in the chat section. We'll read your question, or you could raise your hand virtually and we'll unmute you after the presentation. And as Dr. Lawrence was mentioning, we have all of our previous webinars on YouTube. And our last webinar was entitled Shared Mobility. And so feel free to check that out at the YouTube channel. So now I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers, Dr. Billy Fields and Dr. John Renne. Dr. Billy Fields is an associate professor at Texas State University. His research focuses on understanding the key elements of resilient communities. He is the lead author of Adaptation Urbanism and Resilient Communities and co-editor of Transport Beyond Oil. He directs the International Sustainable Transportation Engagement Program, an annual study abroad program in the Netherlands, exploring best practices in active transportation. Prior to joining Texas State University, Dr. Fields was director of the Center for Urban and Public Affairs at the University of New Orleans and research director for the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, where he developed and explored the concept of trail-oriented development. Before his academic life, he was also a raft guide in the mountains of North Carolina, an ice cream clerk at Harrods in London, and a food runner at Commander's Palace in New Orleans. Our second speaker, John Renne, is a professor and director of the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning in the Charles Schmidt College of Science at Florida Atlantic University. His books include Resilient Transportation Systems, Policy Planning and Implementation, which is forthcoming, Adaptation, Urbanism, and Resilient Communities, Transforming Streets to Address Climate Change, which we're going to be discussing today, Transport Beyond Oil, Policy Choices for a Multimodal Future, Transit-Oriented Development, Making It Happen. Dr. Renne's work focuses on creating sustainability and resilience through land use and transportation systems. He is active in the professional community and serves on a number of boards of professional associations and corporations. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start and then I'll pass it over to Billy in a little bit. Let me share my screen here. It's good to see many of you, and it's nice after 7 years having been able to step down as the co-chair of this committee, so I can focus my time on other endeavors like writing books. But I definitely plan to stay involved in the committee. And so I want to thank Michael and Jason for organizing this, and Elham and Ali for also helping to make this happen. So we're excited to present to you our new book, which is in print. I have my copy right here, so you can actually get a physical copy of it. And so this is a book that Billy was really, you know, the driving force behind this, and Billy did the lion's share of the work on this. So Billy's gonna, you know, Billy and I are gonna kind of tag team this presentation, but, you know, Billy's going to probably present more of the slides because he's the lead author and he did more of the work. I enjoyed working with Billy. As Elham mentioned, you know, I am a professor at Florida Atlantic University. Here's my contact info if you need to reach me. But I want to just kind of start out by saying that, you know, I don't just study these sorts of things. I actually practice a lot of these behaviors. And I live, you know, I've lived in a number of different places. I grew up in a very suburban location where I'm actually at right now. I'm in kind of an exurban. I grew up about 80 miles north of New York City in the Hudson Valley, which is where I'm at now, visiting some family. But I've lived in Boulder and Denver, Colorado. I lived in Fremantle, Australia. I've lived in New Orleans, and now I live in South Florida. And I've been fortunate in, you know, most of the places I've lived to be able to ride a bike and to use transit. And now I'm able to kind of, you know, pass those behaviors on to my own children. And where I grew up, it was very car dependent, and I was very, you know, very socially isolated until I moved away when I was 18. I couldn't wait until I turned 16 in order to get a driver's license, just so I could literally go do something. There was nothing I could walk to other than woods, which was kind of nice in some ways. But, you know, by the time you're 16, you're ready for other things other than walking around the woods. But the point I want to make is that, you know, I experience a lot of challenges in my commute from my home in West Palm Beach to my kids' school. They go to public school. And that includes very unsafe streets, very unsafe crossings, a lack of infrastructure. And often we get a lot of impacts of climate change, including sea level rise. I have to bike along the Intracoastal Waterway, which connects the Atlantic Ocean. And we have on several times a year during what's called the king tides, which is the highest tides of the year because the moon is closest to the earth, so the tides are higher. We are biking through salt water in order to get to school. And so sea level rise isn't something that's, you know, far off in the distant future. We're already experiencing it here. Colleagues of mine who live in Fort Lauderdale, they're already experiencing a lot higher water levels than we are in Palm Beach County. They're getting, you know, 18 inches of sea level rise, flooding streets, coming up through the storm drains in the reverse direction about 60 days of the year. So it's here. This isn't something in the future. And the book that we're about to talk about is going to try to address how do we not only address these issues by adapting our infrastructure, but how do we adapt our infrastructure at the same time as mitigating future carbon emissions by reducing carbon through modal shift to less carbon intensive modes. So, you know, moving away from single occupant vehicle modes to more multimodal options. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Billy. I'm going to probably drive the slideshow presentation. So Billy, just kind of give me the nod when you want me to move on.
Yeah, and John, just as an aside, I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but it looks like half the slide, yeah, there we go, is kind of off the screen there. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you just kind of scooted it over there.
I didn't do anything, so that's weird.
There we go. That looks right.
Let me try. Is that look bad?
I think it's when it's in full screen mode. That's when we lose half the slide.
Okay, I'll just keep it in this mode then.
Okay, we'll just roll with it.
Sorry.
Well, I really appreciate being here. Back in the day, I was on the TRB bicycle committee, so it's always nice to be back in TRB mode. I finished that up maybe 5 years or so ago, and always love to step back in. John and our path actually crossed when I was in New Orleans. I was at the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy in 2005 to 2007 or so, working as the research director. Hurricane Katrina happened, and I had been involved with active transportation and bicycling, and that's when I became really interested in hazard mitigation and understanding disasters and resilient communities. So I went back to the University of New Orleans, and John and I worked together there. And that's kind of where the story begins. There's a connection between walking, biking, and resilient communities. John just laid that out in kind of personal terms. And what we'll do throughout the book is kind of give you a sense of how communities are dealing with that, because they're individual choices that we all make, but those individual choices are framed and shaped by the communities we live in. So there's been a real movement of communities pushing forward with resilience and tying those pieces together. And what we do is we look at this idea of resilience. In many ways, resilience is a normative term. It depends on what you want to bounce back to. So resilience is frequently seen as this idea of bouncing back from disasters. And that's really when we were looking at Katrina, that's what we were looking at. In the intervening time period, resilience theory and the sort of scholarship on resilience has really pushed forward. And now there's really a strong movement that says that bouncing back is not enough. We need to figure out how to bounce forward. And so, John, if you'll switch to the next slide, thanks. When you look at resilience overall, what you find is that in the 80s and 90s and even into the early 2000s, there was very little scholarship on resilience. It's interesting. It was really the disasters of Katrina and Sandy and others that really pushed resilience scholarship forward. And so we begin our book looking at resilience. What does resilience mean? And we set this in context to streets. You know, resilience is a big idea and big term. What we want to do is center it down on streets and public spaces. What makes a resilient street? And so that's really at the core of what we're asking when we look at the book. And we set this in a policy context because we have a policy problem. And the policy problem is, unfortunately, that we live in the era of climate change, and transportation was one of those significant driving forces behind climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions make up about 28% of all, transportation makes up about 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. When you add indirect sources on top of that, it can end up being about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions can be traced back to transportation. And then we have the fatality and serious injury problem of 40,000 or so, unfortunately, fatalities in the United States in the transportation sector. And then finally, we don't really think about this, but streets occupy a significant part of our communities. They're about 30% of the land area in most cities. And when you add parking on top of that, it can end up being 50% of all space. So the way we use our streets, the way we think about our streets is vital. And if we utilize the sort of framework of resilience as bouncing back after a disaster, we just bounce back to what we had before. We bounce back to those pre-existing status quo conditions that really aren't acceptable. If we're serious about climate change, if we're serious about resilience, we need to find better ways to put those pieces together. And that's really what our book looks at. So what we did, John, if you go to the next slide, thanks, is we created a framework for understanding resilience. And really, this is an exploratory framework, right? So as you could see from the literature earlier, there was really very limited research on resilience as early as like 15 years ago. So resilience theory is expanding, and there's very limited sort of real discussion of streets in resilience. What is a resilient street is an outstanding question for us to look at. So what we do is we surveyed the literature, and you'll be familiar with these sort of parts, is compact development, sustainable transportation, blue and green infrastructure, and then equity. Those are the sort of key factors that create a resilient street system. And we coined a term to sort of put all those four different buckets together, and we call this adaptation urbanism. We're adapting to climate change that's already kind of baked in. And we're looking at how cities themselves, the sort of good urbanism, good bones of cities, can be utilized as a way to mitigate future greenhouse gas emissions. So with those sort of four core elements, our goal really is to sort of look at how communities around the country, and around the world are addressing these issues. And as we said, it's a nascent movement. So what we found is that some communities were really bouncing forward, and many communities were just kind of bouncing back and doing a few things. So we looked at Copenhagen and Rotterdam, who were really kind of at the forefront of bouncing forward. London, who was doing some really good work, but trying to figure it out. And then New Orleans and Miami, who had some good projects, but may not have figured out how to incorporate all four of those elements at the same time. We also, in a concluding chapter, look at policy innovations from Amsterdam, Barcelona, Delft, Utrecht, and then in North America, Vancouver. And we sort of weave those pieces together. So in terms of sort of the methodology of the book, what we did is we looked at resilience plans in those case study cities. And what we wanted to know is how close or how far are they from integrating climate mitigation and adaptation into their resilience plans at the street level. So we created a series of terms in each one of the plans and did like a really in-depth plan analysis. And that's in one of our appendices. But we also wanted to tie plans to places. So what we did, and the image that you see to the right here, this is Rotterdam, just outside of Central Station in Rotterdam. And it's just such a perfect place. It shows you how you can begin to tie these sort of green and blue infrastructure elements, which you see components of from the canals to the green space there, with traffic calming that makes it really easy to walk and bike, and then connects you to transit. This image, if you've ever been there, it looks like the rest of the Netherlands. It doesn't look particularly extraordinary, but when you scale this up, that's what makes the difference in greenhouse gas emissions and the quality of life and safety of your communities. So we tie plans to places there in our analysis. So what we'll do then is really try to sort of show you what we found. In Rotterdam, you see a picture here of the Zoho Resilience District. It's a really perfect example of kind of what we're talking about. This used to be an old street segment. They actually have walking and biking access now. They closed the street to cars, but walking and biking still, it's open to walking and biking, but it's also open to managing water. The Zoho sign that you see here will actually fill up with water. There's an elevated rail line. They're actually trying to revitalize. It's actually kind of going to try and be their High Line in Rotterdam, but it's a really interesting project. But the water comes off of it. It fills up those barrels that you see. That's the Zoho. And then when there's no limited water, the water comes out or it fills up in times of heavy rain, and it's an amenity for the community. These type of things really work well. And as we said, communities of Rotterdam and Copenhagen really pushing forward. And then London, Miami, and New Orleans have really fascinating sort of project level discussions, but aren't as integrated. John, if you go to the next slide. Thanks. So really what we're trying to do is look at how our streets can move from being the driving force behind greenhouse gas emissions, fatalities, and then spaces of division and impervious surfaces, and really become places of the community where we see kind of vision zero transportation with this sort of sponge city idea of soaking up water, tying those pieces together. And what we found is those type of streets are developing right now. Next slide, thanks, John. So what we're trying to do is redefine streets. So we'll take a look at what streets mean, and really part of this is about changing our minds. The definition of street, for example, in Webster's, is the part of a street where a vehicle goes. That's kind of the traditional definition of how streets operate. And if you go back to the 1930s, Le Corbusier laid this out perfectly. Basically, he was going to live 30 miles away from his office in one direction, and his secretary was going to live 30 miles away in another direction. We shall use up tires and wear out surfaces and gears and consume oil and gasoline. Unfortunately, that vision that sounds so dated is actually embedded in our landscape. And really what we're seeing is really a political battle, and we trace this in the book, of how that definition of streets is basically in conflict with a new sort of resilient streets definition. So what we did is we looked at kind of what the structures are to maintain streets. And in sort of TRB, you guys know all this, but basically we have a series of standards, and those standards really promote this sort of bureaucratic inertia. And it's super hard to change. You can see with the discussions with the MUTCD recently, it's very, very difficult to change those standards. And those standards help to create the streets of the past, those streets that Le Corbusier laid out. But they're being challenged by other groups, resilience, public health, Vision Zero. And so what we have is this political tension in place right now. And what we're, if you move forward, John, thanks, really looking to do is examine what those cities have done that have redefined streets and transportation. So a good emerging definition of streets, instead of just that vehicular sort of focus, is public spaces that provide access for movement, public infrastructure, commerce, and public life. And a great example of this sort of streets of the future example is Plantage Middenlaan in Amsterdam, just near the central station in Amsterdam. This used to just be a regular street. You can actually go back in Google Street View and actually look at it in time. But in 2009, there was a tram that ran down the middle and a concrete sort of path. There were little bits of walking and biking on the side. And over the last 10 years, essentially what Amsterdam has done is created this green, spongy surface in the middle that also creates this great place. And what they've done is created a super efficient transportation system. So the tram that you're looking at carries about 100 people. Imagine 100 cars trying to fight through this space at the same time. It's very different. So spatial efficiency, water management, place function, and active transportation. All of those things are baked in now into this community. And what you do is when you scale that up again, you start ending up in really different sorts of trajectory in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So what I'll do is give you just a couple more examples here. Copenhagen, as I said, was one of our sort of really great examples from the book. And if John, you'll go to the next slide. Tosingaplads was really one of the inspirations for the book. I was actually leading my study abroad program over to the Netherlands, and I made a stopover in Copenhagen and heard about this square. And I said, oh, I've got to go check this out. And when I went, my mind actually sort of folded in on itself. You see the image at the top from 2009, and what you see is just kind of an ordinary little square with a bunch of asphalt. Right after 2009, 2011, 2012, there was a giant flood in Copenhagen. And basically, many of the basements and areas around this area flooded. And so city leaders said, we need to do something different. We need to take this space and make it green and use green infrastructure to tie our communities together. And that's what they've done. I interviewed the lead project manager for this, Renne Lindsay, and he said, the point of Tosingaplads is that it works when it's raining, but more importantly, it works when it's not raining. So water can actually soak up there during a heavy rainstorm, but the rest of the time, it's just a lovely green oasis in the city. There's traffic calming on the sides. It works great. Here's another example just north of here in the Resilience District called St. Keldsplads. Danish is poor, sorry about that. But again, here's an image I took in 2017, just an ordinary asphalt roundabout. In 2019, 2 years later, what you see is an urban forest that soaks up water, that allows families with kids to move through it safely, cafes on the side in terms of economic development. So really what we're looking at is, in addition to the climate mitigation and climate adaptation, that's kind of the real core of the sort of work here, you get the co-benefits of increased quality of life, decreased pollution, and then the sort of space for green and blue infrastructure. These type of projects really exist. They exist in spaces, and increasingly you can visit them. Here's another, this is a really nice, simple project. So resilience districts are great, but you got to start somewhere. So here's another project. It's a bioswale buffered cycle track, just perfect. So essentially, imagine that to move forward with this, what we found was that cities were utilizing Vision Zero type approaches, where essentially you traffic calmed local streets. Or where you had higher speed streets like this one, essentially what you did, you buffer them and put in cycle tracks. If we start doing those two type of things, that's the kind of push for adaptation urbanism that we found around in our case study examples. And then finally, just a quick example from Vancouver to show you that you don't have to be in Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Rotterdam to make this work. Small mini traffic circles, you have bioswale buffers, and then my favorite example, I think it's covered over, you may be able to see it, is this used to be a street on the right, and they closed part of the street, and now there's a cycle track running through. Traffic calms the area. Kids went back and forth through the area. It's beautiful. And then on larger streets, and that's the next slide, we saw cycle tracks that were buffered with green infrastructure. Doing those two things creates a Vision Zero street system, and it improves safety, and it begins to adapt our cities to climate change. So here's an image from Vancouver as well, and I don't know if you can see the person who's in the piano, but it's circled in red there. It's a fantastic sort of example of a street closure leading to public space and public life. So what if we closed a street to cars, added better water management, cafe seating, and a piano? You can do all sorts of interesting place management functions when we begin to rethink streets. So what we found is this tension that's developed. Some communities are pushing forward with this sort of bounce forward approach, and many aren't. And that's really the sort of tensions that we found in the book. John, do you want me to keep going here with Rotterdam real quickly?
Yeah, why don't you do Rotterdam, then I'll do New Orleans.
Okay, we'll go pretty quickly. I've already mentioned Rotterdam before, but what we do in the book is we do a series of case studies, as I said, and we really delve into the specifics of place and how it works. So Rotterdam, most of Rotterdam is below sea level. It's protected at the coast by a series of structural defense systems. But within that system, you also have this new sort of living with water approach that's developed in the Netherlands. And in many ways, the book owes its genesis to that movement, because in the study abroad trips that I took over there and then the meetings that I had with the professionals, what you really see is this sort of integrated approach to water management developing in the Netherlands. The Netherlands exists because they're able to manage water. And within their communities, within the sort of cities themselves, they've been really working to add the green and blue infrastructure to their cities. Here's a fantastic sort of old example. You have canal systems moving water throughout the city, but they also act as sort of as places in the community. Some of them in most of the rest of the Netherlands, you see the kind of hardscaped canals. Some in the Netherlands, you see the sort of green spaces. You also see a movement towards water squares. Yeah, that was the image there. You also see a movement towards water squares. I showed you some examples from Copenhagen. Here's an example of the water square that's in Rotterdam. This is also near the central square. Most of these places you can, Central Station, you can go to their train station and walk around and have these amazing projects there. But a perfect example, when it rains a ton, if the basketball court, which you see in the center there with the green kind of colors, fills up with water. And then when it doesn't rain, it's a basketball court. So these multifunctional places are increasingly being utilized. And John, the next slide, what you see as well is this movement towards utilizing street space to soak up water. So there's a series of kind of test pilot projects with permeable pavement to look at how permeable pavement can be used and integrated into the sort of green infrastructure sphere, connect those two sort of systems together. And then on the next slide, one of our co-authors, Lilian Gierling, actually worked on a project in her own neighborhood. They redid a street. There's a fantastic program called the Right to Challenge, where neighbors can actually say, hey, we want to design our street in our community. And you know, as long as it fits the sort of basic criteria of the city and doesn't cost more, neighbors can actually work to create projects. And so our co-author on the work, Lilian Gierling, worked on this project, basically tying green infrastructure and then improved walking and biking together. I think, yep. And then all of that ties together into sort of this broader vision of how to change transportation. Rotterdam was actually bombed by the Nazis in World War II. So many of the streets actually were really, really wide. They city redeveloped in the 1950s under the same template that Le Corbusier laid out, right? And so you had these giant streets, and what the story of Rotterdam is about saying, we could do something different. They realized that there's an opportunity for change. And what you see now is that walking, biking, and transit, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of all trips. Rotterdam is broadly seen as not a great biking city in the Netherlands, but they're still 25 or so percent of all trips. So what you've seen is this reinvention of streets. And John, the next slide actually shows how they're doing that today. This project happened over the last couple of years. And what you've seen is this used to have, this was one of the main streets into Rotterdam, and the street was redeveloped, taking away car lanes and adding a beautiful cycle track and then preferencing transit. And what these type of projects do is they improve public life. They mitigate climate change by decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And you don't see the green infrastructure in this, but in several other segments, they also manage water better. And with that, I'll pass the ball to John, and we'll take a look at New Orleans.
All right, thank you very much, Billy. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about New Orleans, but there's also really some other interesting chapters in the book that we won't have time to discuss on London, and also looking at Miami and South Florida. But New Orleans is a place where I moved in 2005, right before Hurricane Katrina. And since then, we've seen this is not Hurricane Katrina flooding, catastrophic levee failure. This is just regular sort of rain flooding that, New Orleans experiences on a routine basis. In fact, because I, still own property in New Orleans and go back there frequently, I get text message updates from the city, kind of warning residents when we're going to have these sorts of flooding events. And just even in the last 2 weeks, there were about 4 or 5 days that I got, blast text messages from the city saying, be prepared for this kind of heavy flooding. So this is just kind of heavy downpour flooding that New Orleans gets. The city is one of the oldest in America, over 300 years old now. It's, about 2/3 below sea level. The historic areas are still above sea level. The water, is one of the greatest existential threats for the future of New Orleans. They have, a series of pumps and levees, and that is vital to making sure that the city is, that it thrives, because without those infrastructure, homes and cars would fill up and it would flood because it's under sea level. Below sea level, it has to be pumped up outside the levee system into predominantly Lake Pontchartrain, and then eventually out, to the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Katrina exposed a lot of social vulnerability, inequity, and we're seeing those tensions and issues today. So, bouncing back is certainly not going to be good enough, if we want to address a lot of equity issues and really just, allowing the city to survive in the future. We really need to kind of bounce forward. So with regards to resilience, equity, and climate gentrification, we're seeing that flood risk and livability are key drivers of price and value. So people are willing to pay more for homes in neighborhoods that, do not flood. But the city is investing in green infrastructure to enhance safety and add community value. And then what that does is it actually, it impacts the housing market. And so then, when those neighborhoods and those investments are made, the housing in those areas get more expensive. And so what happens is that less affluent residences are pushed to more areas of low-lying with increased risk and increasingly unaffordable insurance. So New Orleans is a bit of the canary in the coal mine. If you look around the country, you know, we're going to start to see these issues. We're seeing these issues play out in South Florida already, but we're going to see more of these issues playing out in cities like New York and Boston, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, you know, any coastal area that, you know, we're going to see more of this happening. And they've been making, you know, efforts towards promoting livable and resilient streets to resilience districts. So there's a big project, some big projects that, you know, are recently completed or currently underway. One of the most exciting projects that has been completed in recent years is the Lafitte Greenway. This is one of the projects where I first met Billy, because at the time he was working for the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy and came down and spoke about this project. It's a green swath of land that was basically, you know, a somewhat abandoned corridor that was brought back together and provides a very significant non-motorized travel benefits to the people living between what's, you probably know, the French Quarter, but right up through mid-city in New Orleans. So it's several miles long, and it connects a lot of neighborhoods together with a very safe and a very efficient way to get around on biking, scooters, walking. And so, you know, increasingly though, this area allows for the collection of water, the percolation of rain back into the ground without having to channelize a lot of the stormwater underground. And so New Orleans has been incredibly engaged in active transportation. I actually served for a number of years on the bicycle advocacy organization's board known as Bike Easy. And since I left about 5 years ago, you know, the organization has just continued to thrive. And so they have worked to basically get the city to commit to 75 miles of new or upgraded bikeways within 2 years. You can see the bike map here shows the different infrastructure that now connects most of the city together. One thing I'd like to note though, like many cities, is that, you know, there's been a lot of work done in the city of New Orleans, which is a relatively small city. It's about 7 miles across, but the suburbs are still quite dangerous, very little infrastructure for cyclists. So, you know, while the city is not perfect, but is improving, and you can see a lot of good pictures here of crosswalks and, you know, really nice landscape features, rain gardens and bulb outs and things of that nature. We're not really quite seeing this level of advancement in the suburban areas of New Orleans. So that's one of the great challenges that we're going to face as we kind of move forward is how do we really bring these ideas, not just to central cities, but out into suburban communities. So, you know, during the past year, the pandemic, we've seen a lot with regards to inequality, you know, a lot of marches in New Orleans promoting civil rights. And some of that, you know, is that there is a increased exposure of bicycle and pedestrian fatalities amongst the folks who are in the minority groups. And New Orleans, you know, is a predominantly Black community. And, you know, these white bikes are painted and, you know, put on locations where we see crashes. And it's increasingly not just about transportation, but, you know, how do we tie this in with affordable housing? And we didn't get into that quite so much into this book, but, you know, it's an important topic, obviously, that AMS 50 looks at is, you know, how do we tie in land use and transportation and economic development? Because we need to have safe and resilient streets, but we also need to make sure people can access that. So to wrap this up, you know, what are some of the implications? You know, we're seeing the impacts of climate change here on the left. That's in New Orleans during Katrina. On the right is just routine flooding that we're seeing in South Florida. I mentioned earlier, you know, we're seeing a lot of routine flooding. That's about during the king tides. And so we have these professional silos that we exist in. You know, no offense to TRB, but TRB is the transportation silo. Okay. Our committee, looks at, looking across these silos. But still, we know that that's a challenge. Well, we never really talk much about how do we manage streets from a transportation perspective, but also as a water management perspective. And then, of course, how do we address the environmental issues of dealing with climate change, right? We tend to work in our own little silos, a little kind of humorous here. Disasters really don't care about silos. A disaster comes through and it raises often the need to work outside of our silos. But increasingly, we need to think outside of our political boundaries. That's one of the greatest challenges I mentioned earlier about the challenges between the city of New Orleans and the suburbs. We see the same issues in Miami, the city of Miami and the city of Miami Beach, which are two separate municipalities, are working very hard to try to address climate change and resilience and sea level rise. But there's a significant swath of South Florida that isn't really doing very much about it. And we're probably going to do another webinar in the future that we'd like to have you all participate in that focuses more on what's happening in South Florida. We're also going to do one that focuses on what's going on in London, because there's just so much in this book that we really can't quite cover in a short amount of time. Bouncing forward, re-envisioning streets as a central resilience platform for creating safe, climate equitable, space-efficient cities, substantively linking funding to core outcomes of policy concern. These are some of the key concepts that we conclude in our book that really need to happen. And then politically linking, building linkages between different but like-minded agendas like Vision Zero, equity, climate, smart growth, public health. This is an example from Seoul. This is not from the book, but we have a lot of other good examples in the book, like from Utrecht, where we look at these opportunities to revision corridors. This used to be a highway, and the mayor, who then became president of South Korea, worked to uncover and demolish the highway and replace it with a very effective multimodal street that reopened the waterways of cities to be a public amenity. And so to the extent that, this even dovetails with landscape architecture, that is so important to vitality. To kind of wrap this up, why don't I turn it back to you, Billy, and why don't you cover these last two slides here?
Yeah, so one of the real benefits of this project is John and I get to go around the world and meet all these fascinating people who are helping to push these changes forward. And one of the organizations that we met with was Mobicon Consulting, based out of Delft in the Netherlands. And Mobicon has been working really to re-envision streets. And one of the things that you probably don't know is that Amsterdam wasn't Amsterdam until people pushed to make it different. The same is true about Copenhagen and other places. There's been a political movement to re-envision streets. And one of the places that you see this sort of battle taking place now is in Barcelona. This is a picture from the Super Illes in Barcelona, which really are just traffic calm streets in the heart of the city. And they're wonderful. And when you do that, what you can see here is this street used to just have cars moving up and down it. And the second you took the cars away, you started to see people moving back into the streets with the public life. And you've seen that same thing happen during the COVID-19 pandemic in many places. We also covered that at the sort of start of the book to sort of lay that, the sort of changes and tensions that you see. So in one of the tweets that Mobicon had, they said, how would you prioritize space on your street to make it welcoming? I just love that question. It's a totally different question than most transportation planners ever ask, but it's a core question if we're going to start to create better places for people and make our cities more adapted and more climate mitigated. And I just wanted to point out too that I just read an article that Richard Florida and Joel Kotkin wrote. It was Richard Florida tweeted it. I think it was yesterday, and they take a look at the changes in cities, and they noted that about a third
of Americans are still working at home today, you know, over a year after the start of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, it was only about 5%. So now it's currently at a third. And there's been, they cited some research that said they expect, some you know, experts expect that that number will permanently end at around 20% of people working from home. So a threefold increase of people working at home full time. Okay, that's 100% of the time working at home, basically within, you know, a very short period of time. And up to 50% of the American population will work at home at least one day per week moving forward. So, you know, this is, they said, the greatest changes that we're seeing since World War II. And I really think the time is right to be able to start asking these questions about our streets, because it's really, we've gone through a very significant event, and we can really rethink our streets. I'll put this up. That if you go to Routledge website and you, or Google Adaptation Urbanism, there's a discount code here, and we could put a link in the chat. I don't know if you mind doing that, Billy.
It's already up there.
Yeah, the discount code is ESBAC.
Okay.
The paperback, ESBAC, the paperback is regularly priced at $44.95. The ebook is at $40.45. I don't know why anybody would ever buy the hardcover at $160. But if you want to do that, then by all means, you'll get 20% off of you know, any of these prices that you see up there. So we want to thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can maybe do some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Renne and Dr. Fields. That was an amazing presentation, and it just covered so much more ground than I myself was anticipating. It looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. Dr. Fields already kind of answered the first question about the difference between blue and green infrastructure, but if you wanted to add more to that.
Yeah, let me just jump in just for a second on that. It's also, it's helpful to think of green infrastructure in relation to gray infrastructure. So basically we tend to put water underground in pipes and then move that water away. And that's, broadly speaking, the way that we've created the drained city. We delve into the water management side as well. We clearly come from the transportation side, but we've been trying to reach out to our water management professionals as well. But there's this system of moving water and pushing it away, and it's frequently thought of as gray infrastructure. Green infrastructure developed over the last 20 years or so as a way to sort of use natural and naturalistic surfaces to accomplish many water management functions, but in the same way to also be more holistic and get place, functions, quality of life, lots of other different types of functions. And what we've seen is this sort of movement for green infrastructure, and then blue infrastructure is similarly like canals and other areas that function in the same way, is this movement to take those and then integrate those into the city. And that's really what we're tracing in the book.
I just want to say, I just posted a note to Jason, who was asking about New Orleans being below sea level. It was drained, you know, the swamps were drained, and they developed housing on it and businesses. And I note that it's not unique. You know, many other cities are in that same situation. Not all of them are necessarily below sea level, but a lot of them are in very swampy areas and flown to significant flooding. So, for example, Sacramento, California is one of the most flood-prone cities in the U.S. Tampa is very flood-prone for storm surge, for hurricanes. And so one of the things that I've learned since Hurricane Katrina, and of course, not just Katrina, but Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Harvey, you name it, you know, there's been a lot of them in recent years, is that we have so much vulnerability across the coastal parts of the United States. And, you know, we really kind of focus on the coastal issues, but, you know, you look at the wildfire issues, you know, you look at other hazards that they are also very significant issues. And so, you know, a lot of these the reasons why this happened was baked into a lot of policies that were around for many, many years. So back in the 1960s, you couldn't build homes unless you built a home by building slab on grade. You could not get a loan to build a house and elevate the house out of flooding. And so there's a lot of issues like that. And unfortunately, those areas that are at higher risk, that are more vulnerable, have also become the places of the lowest income places and the places with greater levels of minority populations. And so this is a very significant housing challenge that we're going to be facing, in our future.
I saw that there was another question about green infrastructure and Amsterdam and Europe about maintenance. Maintenance is, so once you break down the silos, right, where we start to think about these holistic benefits, we need to figure out who's going to manage it, what city department, because we then need to go back and put it back in a silo again. And one of the things we found, particularly with the water square in Rotterdam, was maintenance was a huge, huge issue. They didn't really think through how they were going to actually keep the sort of function of movement of water. So the water square is at a school. The kids at the school hang out and they throw their trash frequently into the areas that most of the time don't have water. But the second water hits them, the trash flows in and then clogs the system. So what they found was that it was very, very expensive to have the big sort of water square like you see in Rotterdam. The one in Copenhagen operates a little bit better. It doesn't have those sort of single points of failure. The soaking happens over a much larger area, and then there's actually at the bottom, the drains are actually below ground, and then the water then goes into, if it rains a lot, into kind of a storage facility below. So figuring out how technically to do a lot of this work is important. There's cost factors that are associated with it, but technically it's not super hard for us to begin to work on these projects. We just have to aim differently. So there's a lot that we can learn in terms of figuring out how best to do this type of management, but in terms of aiming differently, we've seen a lot of work in that area. And just like any infrastructure, it takes money to keep it up and moving. And what we've seen is that you can be creative and figure out ways to do that. But sometimes the first generation of these projects have a few weaknesses with it.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of maybe wrap this up, because I know we're getting close to the end of the time, by pointing out a couple of areas that really tie this work directly into the work of AMS 50, okay? And so one is looking at the land use side of things. Both in New Orleans and in Miami, there is a concerted effort to try to promote transit-oriented development, try to promote density on high ground, areas that is less likely to flood, and to try to promote more density, more mixed use, to make those more walkable. Fortunately, it's not a coincidence in both Miami and New Orleans that the historic areas tend to be on high ground, right? And that's because they were built, prior to the dawn of us building levees, draining swamps, and building suburban communities. Most of the low-lying areas were built after World War II in low-lying areas, and they tend to be mostly single-family areas. In New Orleans and in Miami, the TODs are actually on high ground because those areas were prone to flooding, when they were initially built in New Orleans in the 1800s and in Miami, South Florida, in the early part of the 1900s. So they built them on naturally occurring high ground. And so what's happening now is that those areas are gentrifying because not only are, we see gentrification in TOD because of all the normal reasons why TODs gentrify, we're seeing gentrification in these areas accelerate quicker, and they're calling it climate gentrification because they're on high ground. And so this is becoming a particularly big issue in at least in South Florida and in New Orleans. And I suspect that may be the case in other places like New York, for example. If you look in the New York metropolitan area, New Jersey, for example, right? You get a lot of similar issues with historic areas being higher and better protected. And so that's kind of an area of some future research that could be done, is connecting TOD to climate gentrification in those particular coastal areas. The last area, kind of more on the economic development side of AMS 50, is that, you know, these issues are very much tied to the efficiency of our economy. And so, you know, we just did a report at my center called Protecting South Florida. And we see that there's, you know, trillions of dollars at risk of being lost. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be lost just due to sea level rise flooding. It could potentially be significantly devalued if insurance companies collectively stop providing insurance to protecting these real estate assets. That will drive down the price, which we're starting to see initial signs of. So, you know, we have to work, this really becomes an economic, you know, a very, very significant economic issue that, you know, we have to grapple and figure out. You know, we can't solve it. Like, one city can't solve this problem. They have to work with local, state, you know, regional agencies to begin to find solutions to these problems.
Right, and then Dr. Fields answered Mike's question regarding permeable pavement. I don't know if you wanted to add on to that, Dr. Fields, or just leave it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that develops. We're sort of in the first generation of green infrastructure, and because it does filter out pollution, and over time it'll be interesting to see how much pollution it filters out and how much it's left in those areas. But another future area of research. It hasn't been a large problem yet, but we'll have to watch that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you again to our speakers, to all of the participants, to everyone who asked questions. This was a great session. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on the copy as soon as possible. And just as a heads up for everyone, we're planning the next AMS 50 webinar, so please keep your eyes out for the next email regarding our upcoming webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to present to you all. And if you have any questions, please, you know, follow up with us, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all.